February 27th, 1991. The bunker was deep beneath Baghdad, reinforced with meters of concrete and steel, designed to withstand anything short of a direct nuclear strike. But no amount of concrete could shield Saddam Hussein from the reality that was unfolding above ground. The fluorescent lights hummed in the low-ceilinged command center, casting harsh shadows across maps that had become obsolete almost as soon as they were drawn. The air was stale, recycled through filters that couldn't quite eliminate the smell of fear and cigarette smoke. Saddam sat at the head of a long table, his uniform immaculate despite 4 days of living underground. At 53, he still projected the image he had carefully cultivated over 2 decades of absolute rule. The strong man, the modern Saladin, the leader who had stood up to both Iran and the West. But his eyes, usually so commanding and cold, now darted between the faces of his generals and the reports being laid before him with increasing urgency. General Sultan Hashim Ahmad, the deputy chief of staff, stood before a large map of Kuwait and southern Iraq. Red markers indicated Iraqi positions, or rather, where Iraqi positions had been 24 hours ago. Blue arrows showed the American-led coalition advance. The arrows were everywhere, penetrating Iraqi lines like knives through paper. "Comrade President," Ahmad began, using the Ba'athist form of address even in this moment of catastrophe. "The Republican Guard divisions they are no longer combat effective. The Tawakkalna division has ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Medina division is in full retreat. The Hammurabi division... I did not ask for a list of defeats." Saddam's fist slammed on the table, making coffee cups jump. "I asked for an assessment of our defensive capabilities. Where are we holding the line?" Ahmad glanced at his fellow officers, none of whom wanted to be the one to speak the unspeakable truth. Finally, he continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Comrade President, we are not holding the line anywhere. The American armored divisions have penetrated 200 kilometers into Iraqi territory in less than 100 hours. Their air superiority is absolute. Our communications are disrupted. Our supply lines are severed. Our forces are the 4th largest army in the world." Saddam interrupted, his voice rising. 1 million men under arms, 4,000 tanks. We defeated Iran. We held them off for 8 years. And you're telling me that the Americans have destroyed us in 4 days? The silence that followed was answer enough. Saddam's face flushed, his jaw clenched. Around the table sat the men who had helped him build Iraq into a regional military power, or at least the men who had told him that's what they were building. Defense Minister Saadi Tuma Abbas, his uniform heavy with medals from wars both real and imaginary. Intelligence Chief Sabawi Ibrahim al-Tikriti, Saddam's half-brother, whose intelligence had catastrophically failed to predict what was coming. Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, the Christian Ba'athist who had spent months trying to find a diplomatic solution and had been ignored at every turn. On the wall, a television played CNN, the enemy's news, but the only news that seemed to be accurate. The images were surreal, almost incomprehensible. American tanks racing across the desert at speeds Iraqi commanders had thought impossible. Iraqi bunkers being destroyed by laser-guided bombs that fell through ventilation shafts with surgical precision. Iraqi soldiers surrendering in their thousands, their tens of thousands, waving white flags made from undershirts and bedsheets. And the highway. The footage from the Basra road was being broadcast around the world. Thousands of Iraqi vehicles, military trucks, stolen Kuwaiti cars, tanks, armored personnel carriers, destroyed in a miles-long convoy of twisted metal and charred bodies. Western journalists were calling it the Highway of Death. It looked like the end of the world. Saddam stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more dangerous. "How did this happen? Explain to me how the army I built, the army that fought Iran to a standstill, has been destroyed in 100 hours. To understand Saddam's shock and rage, one must understand the miscalculations that had led to this moment. In August 1990, when Iraqi forces had invaded Kuwait, Saddam had been confident of success. Kuwait was small, weak, and militarily insignificant. The invasion had taken less than 2 days. The Kuwaiti royal family had fled. Iraqi forces had occupied the entire country and announced its annexation as Iraq's 19th province. Saddam had calculated that the world would protest but ultimately accept the fait accompli. After all, hadn't the West supported him during the Iran-Iraq war? Hadn't American and European companies sold him weapons and technology? Hadn't Western governments turned a blind eye to his use of chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians? Why would they suddenly care about Kuwait? But Saddam had misread the situation catastrophically. The end of the Cold War had changed the calculus. The Soviet Union, once Iraq's patron, was collapsing and couldn't protect him. The United States, no longer constrained by Soviet opposition, was free to act, and President George H.W. Bush, a former CIA director who understood power politics, had decided to make an example of Saddam. The response had been swift and overwhelming. The United Nations Security Council had condemned the invasion. Economic sanctions had been imposed, and most critically, the United States had assembled a coalition of 35 nations and deployed 500,000 troops to Saudi Arabia in Operation Desert Shield. Saddam had remained defiant. He had called it the mother of all battles and promised that American soldiers would drown in their own blood. He had positioned Iraq as the defender of Arab dignity against Western imperialism. He had taken Western hostages and paraded them on television. He had linked any withdrawal from Kuwait to Israeli withdrawal from Palestinian territories, trying to rally Arab support. But the Arab world had not rallied to his cause. Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia had joined the coalition against him. Even the PLO's support had been lukewarm. Saddam had isolated himself, and he hadn't seemed to realize it. In January 1991, the air war had begun. Operation Desert Storm. For 38 days, coalition aircraft had pounded Iraqi positions with a ferocity and precision that Saddam's military had never imagined possible. Stealth fighters struck command centers with impunity. Cruise missiles hit presidential palaces with meter-level accuracy. B-52 bombers carpet-bombed Republican Guard positions. Wild Weasel aircraft destroyed Iraqi air defenses. By the time the ground war began, Iraq's air force had been destroyed or had fled to Iran. Its command and control was shattered, and its army was blind, deaf, and demoralized. Saddam had believed his army could withstand the onslaught. He had believed that American casualties would be so high that public opinion would force a negotiated settlement. He had believed that his Republican Guard, the elite units loyal to him personally, would hold the line and inflict enough damage to make the Americans reconsider. He had been wrong about everything. General Ahmad continued his briefing, his voice steady despite the catastrophic news he was delivering. The American strategy was based on speed and maneuver. Their M1 Abrams tanks have thermal imaging that allows them to see through the sandstorms that blinded our forces. Their GPS navigation systems allowed them to move through the desert at night, while our forces were stationary. Their Apache helicopters destroyed our armor from ranges where we couldn't return fire. "What about our air defenses?" Saddam demanded. "We had thousands of anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles." "Destroyed in the first week of the air campaign, Comrade President. The Americans used stealth technology we couldn't detect. They used electronic warfare to jam our radars. They used anti-radiation missiles that homed in on any radar that activated. Our air defense network was neutralized before we even knew we were under attack." Saddam's hand moved to his pistol, a gold-plated Browning he always carried, a symbol of his personal power. His fingers traced the grip, a habitual gesture when he was angry or thinking. Around the table, officers tensed. Everyone knew Saddam's reputation. Failure was often punished with execution. To be the bearer of bad news was to risk one's life. But Ahmad pressed on. Someone had to tell the truth. The American ground offensive began with a massive deception. They convinced us they would make an amphibious assault on Kuwait's coast. We positioned our best troops to defend against that assault, but the main attack came from the west, through the desert we thought was impassable. They executed what they call a left hook, a massive flanking maneuver that bypassed our defenses entirely and cut off our forces in Kuwait. He pointed to the map, tracing the coalition advance. The American 7th Corps and the British 1st Armored Division attacked here, destroying the Republican Guard divisions in a series of engagements that lasted less than 100 hours. The American 18th Airborne Corps attacked here, advancing 250 kilometers into Iraq and cutting the highway between Baghdad and Basra. The Marines and Arab coalition forces attacked here, liberating Kuwait City. And our forces? Saddam asked, his voice dangerously quiet. What were our forces doing while this was happening? Fighting, Comrade President. But they were outmatched. The Americans have technology we cannot counter. Their tanks can hit our tanks from 3,000 meters, while our tanks can only engage effectively at 1,000 meters. By the time our tanks got in range, they were already destroyed. Their aircraft have precision-guided munitions that can destroy a single tank from 10,000 meters altitude. Our forces fought bravely, but they were defeated. Saddam finished the sentence, his voice hollow. Defeated in 100 hours. The army I spent 20 years building, defeated. Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister, spoke for the first time. Unlike the generals, Aziz had opposed the invasion of Kuwait from the beginning. He had warned Saddam that the international response would be severe. He had been ignored. Now, he chose his words carefully. Comrade President, we must consider our options. The Americans have achieved their objective, the liberation of Kuwait. If we accept a ceasefire now, we can preserve what remains of our forces. If we continue to fight, we die with honor. Saddam's voice was sharp, cutting. You want me to surrender? To accept humiliation? I want you to preserve Iraq, Aziz replied, his voice steady. The Americans are not advancing on Baghdad. They could. Their forces are 150 kilometers from the capital, and we have nothing that could stop them. But they're not. They've achieved their UN mandate. If we accept a ceasefire, we can end this war and begin rebuilding. Saddam stared at him, his expression unreadable. On the television, CNN was showing footage of Kuwaiti citizens celebrating in the streets of Kuwait City, waving flags, cheering the coalition forces. The anchor was describing it as one of the most one-sided military victories in modern history. The phrase 100-hour war was already becoming a catchphrase. 100 hours, Saddam repeated softly. They destroyed my army in 100 hours. Sabawi Ibrahim, the intelligence chief, tried to salvage something from the disaster. Comrade President, we still have forces in Baghdad. The Special Republican Guard divisions are intact. Our internal security apparatus is intact. We can maintain control of Iraq. The Americans may have won in Kuwait, but they have not defeated the Ba'ath Party. They have not defeated you. It was the right thing to say, the thing Saddam needed to hear. His expression shifted, some of the fury draining away, replaced by calculation. He was a survivor, had always been a survivor. He had survived coup attempts, assassination attempts, wars and purges. He would survive this. You're right, Saddam said slowly. The Americans have won a battle, but not the war. They have liberated Kuwait, but they have not destroyed me. They have not occupied Iraq. They have not removed the Ba'ath Party from power. He stood, straightening his uniform, reasserting his authority. We will accept the ceasefire. We will acknowledge the UN resolutions, but we will not surrender. We will rebuild, and we will remember this humiliation. One day the Americans will pay for what they have done. The generals exchanged glances. It was classic Saddam, never admitting defeat always finding someone else to blame, always projecting strength even in the moment of catastrophic failure, but it was also politically necessary. To admit defeat completely would be to invite a coup, to show weakness to internal enemies. Better to spin the narrative, to claim that Iraq had stood up to the world's most powerful military and survived. General Ahmad spoke again, his voice hesitant. "Comrade President, there is one more matter. The Americans are demanding that we provide information on our chemical and biological weapons programs. They want UN inspectors to verify—" "They want to disarm us," Saddam interrupted. "They want to make us weak, defenseless. We will comply with the minimum necessary to end the sanctions, but we will preserve our capabilities. Our weapons programs are Iraq's insurance policy. Without them, we are vulnerable." It was a decision that would have profound consequences. Saddam's determination to preserve his weapons programs, or at least the appearance of weapons programs, would lead to 12 more years of sanctions, inspections, and ultimately another American invasion that would end his regime and his life. But in February 1991, sitting in a bunker beneath Baghdad, watching his army's destruction broadcast on CNN, Saddam could not see that far ahead. He could only see the immediate humiliation, the immediate need to survive, the immediate imperative to maintain his grip on power. The ceasefire was announced on February 28, 1991. The ground war had lasted exactly 100 hours. Coalition casualties had been remarkably light, 148 Americans killed in action, most from friendly fire or accidents. Iraqi casualties were estimated between 20,000 and 50,000 killed, with perhaps 75,000 wounded. Thousands more had been captured. The Iraqi army, once the fourth largest in the world, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Kuwait was liberated. The emir returned from exile. Coalition forces established a security zone in southern Iraq to protect Shiite populations from Saddam's revenge. In the north, a no-fly zone protected Kurdish populations. Iraq was contained, weakened, but Saddam remained in power. In the years that followed, Saddam would spin an elaborate narrative about the Gulf War. He would claim it as a victory. Iraq had stood up to 35 nations and survived. He would build monuments to the mother of all battles, celebrating Iraqi resistance. He would commission paintings showing himself as a heroic warrior defying the West. He would never publicly acknowledge the scale of the defeat, the speed of the collapse, the humiliation of the 100-hour war. But in private, in conversations with his inner circle, the truth was inescapable. The army he had built had been destroyed with contemptuous ease. The military power he had spent 2 decades assembling had been swept away in 4 days. The regional dominance he had sought had been shattered. And most humiliating of all, it had happened so quickly, so decisively, that the world had barely had time to notice the war before it was over. The Gulf War marked the emergence of a new kind of American military power, high-tech, precise, overwhelming. It marked the end of the post-Vietnam syndrome, the restoration of American confidence in its military. And it marked the beginning of Saddam Hussein's long, slow decline from regional strongman to international pariah to fugitive hiding in a hole in the ground. What Saddam said when he saw the U.S. destroy his army in 100 hours was, ultimately, a mix of rage, denial, and desperate face-saving. He blamed his generals for incompetence. He blamed the Americans for using unfair technology. He blamed the Arab nations for betraying Arab unity. He blamed everyone except himself. But beneath the bluster and the blame, there must have been a moment of terrible clarity. A moment when Saddam Hussein, sitting in his bunker, watching the destruction unfold on television, understood that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation, that he had led his country into a war it could not win against an enemy it could not match, that his ambitions had brought not glory, but humiliation, not regional dominance, but international isolation, not power, but weakness. That moment of clarity, if it came, did not last. Saddam was too much a product of his own propaganda, too convinced of his own destiny, too committed to his own survival to truly accept responsibility. He would spend the next 12 years defying UN resolutions, playing cat and mouse with weapons inspectors, and trying to rebuild his power. But the 100-hour war had broken something fundamental. It had exposed the hollowness of Iraq's military might, the futility of Saddam's ambitions, the limits of his power. The world had watched as the fourth largest army was swept aside like sand before a storm, and no amount of propaganda, no monuments to fictional victories, no paintings of heroic resistance could change that reality. In the end, Saddam Hussein's response to the 100-hour war was to survive, to endure, to cling to power at any cost. He survived for 12 more years until a second American invasion finally ended his regime. But the Saddam who was pulled from a spider hole in December 2003, bedraggled and defeated, was the same man who had sat in that bunker in February 1991, watching his army destroyed in 100 hours and refusing to accept the truth. Sometimes, the most devastating defeats are the ones we cannot admit, even to ourselves. And sometimes, the most dangerous leaders are those who learn nothing from their failures, who repeat their mistakes on an ever grander scale, who lead their nations to ruin because they cannot distinguish between strength and stubbornness, between courage and delusion, between leadership and tyranny. Saddam Hussein saw the US destroy his army in 100 hours, but he never truly saw the lesson in that destruction. And that blindness would ultimately destroy not just his army, but his regime, his legacy, and himself.